book about generational trauma, Soviet repressions, drug abuse, and not meant to be love story. What's not to like here? Jacob's Ladder is a 2015 novel written by Ludmila Ulitskaya. Look at me, another female author, I'm doing well. That tells a story of 6 generations of a family that in big part is based on Ulitskaya's own family history. I once again don't have a physical copy to hold, which is not a big deal really because I listen to audiobooks these days, but at the same time my library doesn't have a copy for me to hold as a prop. Such a bummer. In the 1970s, 1980s, Nora Isitskaya, a theater set designer and young mother, finds a box of letters between her recently deceased grandmother Marusia and her grandfather Jacob, whom the family never really speaks of. From this point on, the narrative jumps back and forth between these two timelines, first in the late Soviet period and early post-Soviet period with Nora's story and her son's Yurik's story, and the early 20th century starting from around 1905 through 1950s, and depicting Jacob's story along with his wife Marusia and their son Heinrich, mostly told through the letters between them. Jacob's Ladder is a novel in a very traditional sense. I'm actually not used to it from modern authors. I somehow always expect them to be a little bit more thematical or topical, and this is not it. This is a family saga in a very traditional sense. Ulitskaya herself agrees that she's not really about ideas or complicated language and nuance. She is really about the characters and telling their stories.
Моя литература людей, конечно. Не то, что там совсем нет идей, но меня не так волнуют идеи и не так волнует форма. Она как бы получается.
It doesn't mean that she does not have themes, there are some, but they're not the point. The point is to tell the story of this family, one of many. The title, Jacob's Ladder, obviously takes us back to the Old Testament story of the patriarch Jacob, who had a dream about a ladder that connected heaven and earth. And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to the heaven, and behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. Within the book, this metaphor of the ladder that connects the various generations is also tied in with DNA, how the building blocks of a DNA are essentially like letters and words that combined create this sacred text. The book was spurred on by Ulitskaya discovering her own grandfather's letters and her going to the archives to read his files, as he, like Jacob in the novel, was also deemed the enemy of the people and sent to camps, and the family never spoke of him. Thus, the book is not autobiographical in full sense, but it schemes that line between fiction and reality. What is my impression of the book? Well, I'm rather ambivalent about it. I just simply think that I'm not the audience for it, but let's talk. What I enjoyed about the book is Nora's story. I found Nora to be an interesting character overall, but her journey also the most compelling one. She's not perfect, she's flawed, she's constantly looking for herself, she has failed relationships. Her relationship with her son Yurik is a very troubled one, just like her relationships with her own parents, a rather distant father and a juvenile mother. So it's interesting to see her go through life and see how these relationships evolve and how she grows as well. It's nice to see how Nora learns to accept her mother and the different roles that they played in each other's lives throughout their lives. How Nora never truly understands her father but grows to love him anyways. How she eventually finds herself in a good spot with Yurik and her estranged ex-husband, a rather quirky scientist. There is also her on and off again relationship with a theater director called Tengiz, and I love them as a couple. They are unconventional and messy, but ever so wholesome, so I love that for them. But I also love the resolution of that relationship for Nora and the way that she processes it within herself. She is the type of female character that I need more in my life, the unapologetically real one. Yurik's storyline is a little bit weaker for me. It's the same problem that I had with Donna Tartt's Goldfinch, and I just don't enjoy the drug addiction storylines, so whenever they appear, I kind of check out. So it's just simply not for me. It's done well here, it's handled well, but it's simply not something that I enjoy reading. The only true downside to this storyline set in modern day is the conclusion, or rather new beginning for the family, because, spoilers kind of, but for the story to end, Yurik needs to have a child, and the child is also called Jacob, because it all provides a nice frame for this whole story, but it's simply not as well fleshed out as Nora's story or Jacob's, so it falls a little bit flat here. If we were looking for the theme of the novel, it is generational trauma and how we carry it within us, parents, children, grandchildren, sometimes without even truly realizing it. It is done both bluntly and subtly. Bluntly, in a way, when Nora reads about eczema that Jacob suffered from throughout his life, the same illness that she has, that Yurik has, and the newborn Jacob also has. But there is obviously more subtle ways as well. For example, the stunted communication within the family, how Heinrich is very much ashamed of his father, how Nora never truly understands her father, and at a certain point, Yurik totally disconnects himself from Nora and his father. There is clearly no obvious way of breaking this cycle, but one of the solutions presented is to talk about it. Not to forget, not to sweep under the rug, not to be afraid to look into the past, not to turn away. And in case of the author, to also share with others, because this is a very personal story.
Потому что надо сказать, что очень многие вещи мне были неизвестны, и некоторые остались неизвестны. В общем, это была работа археологическая, конечно. Я ее, насколько смогла, я ее проделала. Вот. И, кроме того, у меня есть ощущение, что эта работа необходимая для каждого человека, что ее надо проделывать каждому. Ну, я писатель, вот так, мне повезло, мою книжку еще, может быть, там кто-то прочитает, но это не имеет значения. Если бы она не была завершена, напечатана, она все равно было безумно важно то, что она сделана. И это на самом деле в некотором роде вот этот вот толчок ко всем нам, молчащим поколениям. Сегодня ломают там копии относительно истории, какая она была, версия истории одна, версия другая. У каждого в семье есть своя версия истории, и она незыблема.
Jacob Asitsky's story might not be special in the sense that there are thousands of people who went through a very similar experience, but it also is unique because there was only one Jacob Asitsky. Jacob Asitsky ended up the enemy of the people not through the fault of his own. He was a victim of a system that was designed and built to break people whether they deserved it or not. In his letters, he tries to process it, as well as the influence that it had on his family, because being related to the enemy of the people also limited your options, but it is not his bloody fault. And the injustice of it all is what makes this story so important and begs for us not to repeat the same mistakes. You know the disclaimer that I had to put in the beginning of the video? It says that Ulitskaya is considered to be a foreign agent by the Ministry of Justice. We're not learning from our mistakes here. Now, it needs to be said that I have an enormous blind spot when it comes to the plight of Jewish people and anti-Semitism. I still haven't wrapped my head around as to why anti-Semitism exists in the first place, so I don't always clock the Jewish characters, and thus I don't always connect their suffering to anti-Semitism. Like here, Jacob is Jewish, but not a practicing one, so his identity is not overly defined by his faith, so it was easy enough for me to overlook. Unlike some other characters in the novel, like a man called Grisha, who tries to marry the Old Testament with physics, mathematics, and biology, he is he is a Jewish character. Not a caricature one, but you cannot miss him. The problem is that Soviet Union was anti-Semitic in many ways, but at the same time, Jacob makes so many missteps. He does not understand where he went wrong. He does things that are objectively counterproductive, so it's easy enough for me to put the blame for his fate on the Soviet regime in general that strived to eradicate any dissent. The early Soviet Union was not a good place for the Jewish people, but it was also not a good one for anybody else. Thus, my brain framed Jacob's story as a story of an intellectual caught in the clutches of a regime that named him the enemy of the people and how that affected his family, rather than the story of a Jewish man. That might very well be my mistake here, but I think it contextualizes the story of individuals, Jewish or otherwise, within the context of the early Soviet history quite nicely. And I think that's the angle a lot of recent fiction takes, trying to bring these stories of the repressed into the spotlight, as many families, if not all of them, have something to tell here. And I've already mentioned the backlash that follows if you talk about the gulags and the repressions when I talked about Zuliha. So we as a nation somehow are still not ready to talk about that less stellar part of our history. This is our black slavery. This is our antebellum South. This is our segregation. As the establishment of the Soviet Union never allowed us to process the history of Russian slavery and monarchy, as it was uprooted and destroyed essentially within the day, in a historical context, and replaced with something else, arguably worse. So now we're dealing with a legacy of colonialism, of military prowess, of the totalitarian state. So we need stories that tackle the entirety of it, but we also need these individual stories. Because, as Tolstoy said, all happy families are very much alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own very unique way. And it's the same thing here. All happy Soviets were happy in the very same way, but the unhappy ones, they were uniquely unhappy. Having said all that, I found it rather difficult for me to connect and relate to Jacob. He comes from that part of intelligentsia that is entirely foreign to me. My family were peasants and proletariat through and through. So I have a certain, not aversion is a strong word, but rather wariness, maybe apprehension towards this type of intelligentsia, which is also not fair. Some of my friends come from these families and arguably that themselves. When it comes to Jacob, I can appreciate his thirst for knowledge, his studiousness, his passion not simply for knowledge, but for utilizing it to help others. Unfortunately, it seems to come in exchange for a criminal naivete when it comes to social awareness and social interactions. And that affected not only his personal life, but his fate in general. When he and his wife had sex for the first time, at breakfast they argued about teachings of Marx and communism, and that was my first indication that they're not going to work out as a couple, because he was being kind of condescending and almost dismissive towards her, and that continued on throughout their relationship. She also takes part of the blame for that relationship. They're simply not a good couple, to be perfectly honest with you, but we'll talk about that in a moment. But worse is the total misunderstanding of the country that he lives in, of what is allowed and what is not. In every letter, he talks about studies that he wants to do, about forming groups of like-minded individuals, and I was just sitting there adding more and more years to his future sentence because, well, hindsight is 2020, obviously, but the Soviet Gestapo was not very friendly towards these ideas that Jacob had, no matter how innocent they were. The irony here is that a character like Jacob had no other way to go but into labor camps and gulags. That's simply the harsh reality of the time that he was born into, and that time was not particularly kind to his type. There is a reveal at the end of the book when Nora goes to Lubyanka to read his file, and we get to learn that one of the characters who was really close to Jacob actually testified against him in 1948. And at first I found it redundant. The case has already been built against Jacob, so there was no need for this testament, but it is character building for that character, but it also shows how the system destroyed people's lives. Jacob went into the gulags, while this character arguably lost a part of his humanity in order to save his own behind, and Nora in that moment even feels sorry for him. It's a complex issue, no way around it. Another important thing is Jacob's love for Marusia, and I think it's important to frame it as such because I never felt it from Marusia's end, but we're also privy to more thoughts from Jacob. His love for her is supposed to carry the story the same way that it carried him throughout years of camps, but I didn't feel it much. It read more as an obsession, like he loved an idealized version of Marusia, and that honestly checks out just based on the amount of time that they spent together, which is not much. He's also such a horny motherfucker. He would have benefited from sexual revolution, that's for sure. Hopefully you will read his letters and feel that love that he has for his wife. Maybe I am too cynical and irony poisoned to get it. I've read reviews that call this love like pure and genuine, so it's not impossible. This part of the novel actually reminded me quite a bit of Dr. Zhivago. It shares a lot of like topical similarities, but also tonal ones. So if you wanted to compare this book to something, that's probably it. Ulitskaya's language is actually pretty simple, but in a good way. I'm generally not very fond of using like diary entries or letters to build your narrative, because within the story, it's really hoity-toity language used in a medium that does not call for it, so it always reads as fake for me, but I digress. Here it is used intentionally, since Ulitskaya's point is that our lives are built of these extracts, of these bits and pieces, sometimes disconnected and random, but they make our history.
То жизнь собирается из этих обрывков, писем, перышек, воспоминаний, и того, что уже даже не имеет материальной структуры, но когда-то ее имело.
That also fits into the narrative structure of the novel, the constant time jumps, because even Nora's story is told in chunks, so it's a stylistic choice. And here I thought I would have nothing to say about the novel. Final thoughts. If you like family sagas or like traditional novels, if you are interested in the fate of the repressed in the 1930s Soviet Union, or you simply like these generational stories, you can check this book out. It's obviously not the best book I've ever read, but it's a perfectly decent one. I'm full of compliments today, aren't I? No, it's not a terrible book. I might not have connected with Jacob that much, but I really enjoyed Nora's storyline. So if anything I've said here is interesting to you, you can check it out.